So next, we're going to have an in-depth exploration of the meaning of dignity within mental health. So I would like to introduce Mr. Chuck Weinberg, LCSW.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Chuck Weinberg. I'm the local recovery coordinator at the Herschel Woody Williams VAMC here in Huntington. A couple years ago, we got named after Herschel Woody Williams. That's a real honor. If you're not familiar with this veteran story, Google Herschel Woody Williams. He was a flamethrower at Iwo Jima. And until he passed a couple years ago, he was the oldest living Congressional Medal of Honor award winner. When I would give talks pre-COVID face-to-face, I used the language. I said, Mr. Williams was given the Congressional Medal of Honor, and a veteran raised his hand and respectfully said, sir, he wasn't given the Congressional Medal of Honor, he earned it. So consistent with our talk today about autonomy and dignity, this is about, we don't give veterans benefits. We don't give veterans treatments. They put their life on the line and they earn those things. And what I'm going to be talking about today, next slide, please, is what's called the recovery model of mental health as we talk about autonomy and dignity. I've been at this VA for 16 years. And when I came to the VA in 2007, with 21 years postmaster's experience, degrees from 2 quasi-Ivy League colleges, William & Mary and UNC Chapel Hill, I didn't know very much about recovery model or veteran-centered care. I was very much the in-charge expert. And so over time, and my job as the recovery coordinator is to teach this model to both veterans and to providers while still providing direct care. And I still mess it up some every day, but I'm in a process of continuous learning. If you look on my wall behind me, that's my wall of truth of things I've learned from veterans or from trainings or from other professionals, all laminated to meet CAR standards. So I'm going to start out with a story, and we'll have a story or two at the end. And I'll try not to go too fast. I tend to get wound up, so I may stop and get a sip of water or take a breath. And stories are very important when we're talking about the dignity of veterans and then wanting to provide recovery-oriented mental health and medical care. There's research that shows, I don't have the citing, but when we ask a veteran, why are you here? We usually interrupt within about 20 seconds because we're very busy. But if we don't take the time to hear the veteran's story, then we can't individualize the care, and then we can't form the therapeutic relationships, the trusting therapeutic relationships that account for positive outcomes and veteran satisfaction with our services. So this bottom line of this recovery model is about optimal outcomes and having veterans be happy with our services. We use evidence-based practices. We don't reinvent the wheel with each veteran. We want to know what helps most people most of the time. But people are not statistical probabilities. People are individuals. We want to use what 2 psychologists, Miller and Duncan, call the practice-based evidence. What helps the person in front of you now? And the only way to do that is to hear their story. And I'm not a veteran, but veterans will say, don't think you know me. Don't think because you know where I served or what my military occupational specialty is. Please get to know me for me. And really, we won't get into trauma theory, but everyone does respond differently to different situations. So here's the first story to illustrate this model. When I came here in 2007, I helped start our MICM program, Mental Health Intensive Case Management. It's in-home services for veterans with severe mental health challenges. And it's the exact model of ACT programs in community mental health, acceptance commitment therapy. You're doing in vivo assessment. You're going to the veteran and seeing how they're doing. And there was a veteran who seemed to meet my stereotype of someone with severe mental illness or with schizophrenia. Seemed to have a lot of paranoid thoughts, impulsive decision-making, problems with relationships, and was chronically homeless. And we're changing some of the details in these stories for HIPAA. First thing we did was we got him good housing in a good, stable place. Felt really good. But every so often, this veteran would pay his bill and check himself out of housing and make himself homeless. Now, from a traditional model of mental health, if you didn't really know the veteran and only knew the diagnosis, you'd say, what is this? This is psychosis. This is illness. Increases medication. But we met with the veteran a minimum of once a week, often 2 and 3 times a week. We got to know the person underneath the label, and we found out that this veteran was lonely. He had nothing to do and no one to do it with. He had no purpose. He didn't have a reason to get out of bed. He was disconnected from his family, and he was leaving to try to find something better. Now, was it completely rational what he did? No, he didn't want to freeze to death. But those other desires to find a better life were rational. They weren't symptoms to be medicated away. So we evaluated his medication, but we also offered him a social skills group so he could form more relationships. And we offered him an opportunity to volunteer so he could find some purpose and a reason to get out of bed. And we tried to connect him to his family. And when this veteran was asked, why do you keep leaving good housing? He had a great answer. He said, because I can. Okay, autonomy. You know, now was he exercising his autonomy in a way that was consistent with his values and goals? Not completely, because he didn't want to freeze to death. But again, that wasn't a symptom. And we're going to talk about that, how in mental health, we tend to pathologize everything. He's being non-compliant, whatever. So before we get going here, let me try to engage y'all a little bit. That's always challenging virtually. Of course, one of the benefits of COVID, if you can say that, is we've gotten better at reaching out to veterans and providers for education virtually. Put in the chat, what is this recovery? What do you think the recovery model is? Put in a word that you think, or a couple of words. If you could put, I don't know. What do y'all think the recovery model of mental health is? And we'll give a minute or so for folks to do that. And it's always the first one. We need the first follower, the first person to put in something. And we'll probably get a few more. Who wants to take a shot at it? Wraparound care, choice, support system, stability, post-traumatic growth, personal relationship with therapist. Okay, appreciate y'all. I just came on at 12. You folks must have really got them going. We got a good group. Yeah, you're going to hear me preach that, and I admit it. I tend to get on my soapbox. The therapeutic relationship accounts for more outcomes than any technique. It's what William Anthony, the late Bill Anthony at Boston University, calls the evidence-based process, the hows as much as more than the whats, the things we kind of take for granted that we need for relationships, validation, unconditional positive regard, listening, reflection. In psychology, they're called the non-specific aspects of care. It's the edifice, it's the backbone. There is no outcomes without it. So in real estate, it's location, location, location. In mental health and dignity-oriented veteran-centered care, it's the relationship, the relationship, the relationship. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to try to get a feel for what the experience is like for veterans when they're having mental illness. And some of this comes from Pat Deegan. And if you're not familiar with her name, look her up. Dr. Patricia Deegan, PhD, Pat Deegan with schizophrenia. And the slide missing from this is pre-illness. And like the circles are all the areas of someone's life. It could be vocational, interpersonal, financial, sexual, and then illness hits, boom, and there's a big illness, big mental health problem hits. And at least initially, this is probably how it feels. Everything else has exploded. And all we have is diagnosis and illness. And unfortunately, although we're getting better, for we professionals, sometimes that's all we see too, is the diagnosis and the illness. Next slide, please. So here we have, and this is a good summary to try to differentiate the traditional model of mental health from the recovery model, which I'm preaching is more in tune with dignity, more in tune with autonomy, getting you better outcomes and having more satisfaction with services. In the traditional model, the provider is the expert. You can't tell already, I like to play expert. I like to say smart things. But in the recovery model, you have two experts in the room. I can teach people coping skills and social skills, but the veteran's the expert on their life and on their experience and their values and their preferences. And if we respect each other's expertise, we're more likely to form those relationships that get us going where the veteran wants to go. So not being a veteran, while veterans are not responsible for me, I will tell a veteran, I'm going to learn about military culture from you when you teach me about your experiences. And so I was doing a group, and I had a veteran, an older veteran who was a helicopter pilot in the first wave of the Vietnam War, about 64. It was a cluster, everything went wrong. And he said his helicopter got shot down, and there were bullet holes through the metal in front of him and bullet holes behind him, but he wasn't dead, or he wasn't sure. He thought he was a ghost for 18 months. He gave me the book, We Were Soldiers Once When Young, by the late Colonel Hal Moore, to understand his experience. Another veteran who went into the Vietnam War later, the late 60s, had a whole different experience. At that point, the country had turned against the war. The morale in the troops was low. There were fraggings. That means our commander's crazy. We're going to try to blow him up. There was racial problems. There was drug problems. And our policy, which we didn't always follow, was we couldn't leave Vietnam. So the Viet Cong would come and hit and then run into Laos. And he gave me the book In Laos to read. And it sets up a nice dynamic again, more human to human, where I'm a teacher, but I'm learning about their experience and about military culture. I've learned to speak the language of veterans. What's the mission going to be? How do we use that warrior ethos to what you have to do now? Helpful. Traditional model, the provider dictates treatment, decides treatment goals. We know what's best. In the recovery model, the key is not even the treatment goals, it's the veteran's valued life goals. And to me, the perfect question to ask a human, regardless of their diagnosis, is what is important to you? The great thing about that question is, as much as I like to talk, I can't tell someone what's important to them. I have to stop and listen. They tell me what's important to them. And then I ask, I don't tell, is there anything getting in the way of what's important to you? And they tell me what they think is getting in the way. And then I say, I have these treatments that can help you get where you want to go, which changes the role of the provider from an in-charge expert to a facilitator or a coach. A veteran who smokes all kinds of cigarettes might say, you know, I'm going to die eventually. Who cares? I like smoking cigarettes. I'm going to die eventually. Who cares? And may not be motivated at all by us telling them how sick it's going to make them. But we may ask the veteran, do you want to see your granddaughter graduate college? Do you want to see your daughter get married? That's why the veteran will make the change, not because we're telling them to. The traditional model kind of focus on negative problems and weaknesses. We want to ameliorate the negative symptoms, but we don't want to just reduce the negatives to zero. The recovery model focuses on strengths and resilience. We want to promote wellness. So a veteran in front of you who feels like they're on the bottom, and it's horrible to be on the bottom, probably has been there before. When you were were you ever on the bottom before? Yes. How did you get out before? Maybe that'll help you get out now. The worst thing is being on the bottom, being afraid you'll never get out, and that can lead to desperation. But these other types of dialogues, not magically over time with trust, can lead to discussions about resilience, changing an identity, a self-identity from a victim to a resilient survivor. Things like post-traumatic growth, where people grow from their pain and find resources they didn't know they had and gain perspective, although often still with pain. The traditional model focuses on diagnostic labeling and negative symptoms, the pathologizing lens. Pat Deegan said when she was 18 years old, she loved sports. She wanted to be a professional athlete, and she had these lovely characteristics of her personality. Sometimes she was quiet and thoughtful. Other times she'd get excited and wound up. I'm kind of wound up myself. But then her psychosis hit, and she had a horrible delusion that she felt all her family members had been replaced by duplicates. So she goes in the hospital, and she's showing real symptoms of schizophrenia, but she's also still a human. And so she's still sometimes quiet and thoughtful, but the staff are saying aloof, withdrawn. Once you're labeled, everything's a symptom. And she's showing real symptoms of schizophrenia. But at times, like she always did, she's getting excited and wound up agitated, manic. Okay. So we really want to watch for that. You know, when patients assert their autonomy, what do we say? They're being non-compliant. They're being resistant. Non-compliance is a system-centered term or a provider-centered term. You're not doing what I recommend. Ambivalence is a patient-centered or veteran-centered term, and we can all relate to that because we don't want to over-identify or enable the veterans, but how many of us in this room need to eat healthier, sleep healthier, drink less, smoke less, and we're thinking about it, but maybe we're not moving on it, which takes you to motivational interviewing and stages of change. And it's a different thing to say that this is a symptom that needs to be eradicated, or how can we help you focus your autonomy in ways that are productive to you and your values. And just, I don't have time to really do this, but when I do long things on the DSM, there it is, the DSM-5, and it has value, okay? If I keep going to the ER, we're thinking I'm gonna have a heart attack, and they keep telling me I have a normal EKG and diagnose me with esophagitis, I'm like, what is going on? Am I crazy? Finally, someone diagnosed me with panic disorder. Thank you. But I usually do this trick. I'll say, hey, here's our DSM. And if we open the DSM, we'll come to a diagnosis, and it tells you the causes of the diagnosis, the etiology, right? And most of you are shaking your heads. It does not tell you causes. A little bit on trauma. Well, if we open the DSM to a diagnosis, it tells you recommended treatments, right? No. Not etiology, not recommended treatments. Isn't that the purpose of a diagnosis? And DSM diagnoses come and go. Hysteria, homosexuality. Y-Digger has a funny, not funny, found in the DSM-3 a disclaimer, and here's what it says. It says, DSM is purported to be a set of categories, separate and discrete from each other, and separate and discrete from normality, but it might not be. How's that for a disclaimer? Because it's not, because it's dimensional. It's not the diagnosed and the undiagnosed, it's how much do you have and how much does it get in the way. So this old model can lead to stigma or self-stigma. A bad case of the I can'ts. Corrigan is the man on stigma. And if you had asked me in 2007, with all my 20 years postmaster's experience and my quasi-Ivy League education, what % of people with the worst mental health problems recover? If recovery means having a high quality of life, I would have said 5%, 10%. Here's the answer, y'all, and the source is Harding et al. While there's no guarantees, while each person's different, while it can take a lifetime of work, 1/2 to 2/3 of folks with the worst mental health problems can recover. Recovery means having a high quality of life. So hope is evidence-based. Hope is evidence-based. And there's an elegant reason for why we have set the bar so low. It's called the clinician's illusion. It's Cohen and Cohen. There are people on this call not out with their mental health problems for fear of discrimination. I take Prozac. I've been in therapy. And when I find appropriate times to share that with clients, they're amazed because I'm a successful person. Wow, if he needs help, maybe I can get help. So Dr. Fred Feast, Dr. K. Redfield Jamerson, Dr. Daniel Fisher, reducing stigma. But if you're told how sick you are long enough, you get a bad case of the I6. I can't get better because I'm so sick. I accept all my diagnoses. And when Deegan was given the prognosis of doom, you'll be lucky to stay on your meds, smoke cigarettes, and drink coffee and stay out of the hospital, her response was baloney, and they charted no insight, anosognosia. There's a difference between not accepting the need for help or not accepting the stigma and discrimination that comes with the label. Whew, I need a drink. Okay, the recovery model increases empowerment and engagement. And the traditional model, mental health problems are seen as chronic. Here we have hope as evidence-based. The traditional model, it's kind of cookie cutter, one size fits all. You have to fit in the system. Recovery model is individualized. Next slide, please. So there's a lot about stigma. There's external stigma, and these are the attitudes of other people. It could be family members. It could be, unfortunately, the church, the media, that affect how people feel about themselves. And it's an overgeneralization based on knowing one thing about someone. Stigma could be about race, gender, age, all this, all Democrats, all Republicans, all blacks, all whites, all people with mental health problems. And this usual idea is that are what? Dangerous, weak, or crazy. That's bad enough, and it's getting better with people being more open and getting with education. But the worst thing is internalized stigma. You tell me that long enough, I make it part of my identity, and that inhibits my recovery. Where I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm human like you are. I can't solve my own diabetes. That's why I need to get mental health help, and I'm going to go forward with my recovery. All right. So stigma is maybe the number one reason that veterans who need mental health care don't engage or don't stay engaged. And again, not wanting to be labeled, judged, or discriminated against is not irrational. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, think of military culture. You know, in service, man, you got no problems. You got to do it. You have a job to do. Veterans don't want to be seen as weak. They're afraid their careers will be negatively affected. Before I worked for the VA, a veteran came to see me, and I'm a social worker, so I can't prescribe. And all he really needed, and he was a pilot in the Air Force, was a little bit of a low dose SSRI. He would have been fine, but it would have showed up in his urine, and he would have been grounded. So instead, he had to sleep worse, concentrate worse. He was able to get therapy, though. Veterans might say this is the only place I talk about this stuff, particularly in groups. Group is a wonderful paradox. What? I'm up to my neck with problems. You're going to put me in a room with other people up to their neck with problems? If you can get a veteran in a group, and if it's a good group, they never leave. Because one, they're all veterans, and two, they can actually walk in someone else's shoes. And then a wonderful thing happens, and a source for this is Steve Hayes, talks about purpose from pain. Who wants pain, but I can get purpose from my pain? A veteran who can share their successes, what they've learned, share their mistakes, and inspire and help another veteran. That's money. It's amazing. And then we're even going to talk about provider stigma. What? I have stigma too. I'm a published author in journals. It's hard for us to believe the good guys have stigma also. So what do y'all think about that? I'm about to talk about mental health provider stigma. Does that seem unlikely to you? Rare, baloney, common? What do y'all think about that? Provider stigma. I see the chat for 20 minutes remaining. Thank you. Anyone want to comment on that? Have I lost my mind, or you see it every day? Provider stigma. All right, well, maybe we'll just roll with that. Let me see. Happens often. See it all the time. Okay. No, providers don't get immune to horror stories. No, that's a whole different thing. That's compassion fatigue. It rubs off on us. Good point. Because we're human. That's right. I'm the expert. Exactly. Next slide, please. So other causes of stigma, there's a double standard involved. I worked in a nursing home, and a woman was post-throat cancer, and she had a stoma, a hole in her throat. And she was smoking in her stoma. And I was offering lots of education on why that wasn't a good idea. But no one would even breathe a word of involuntary commitment, even though she was a danger to herself. She was doing something dangerous to herself. Why was there no talk of involuntary commitment? Because it was her right to do it. It was her right to do it. So, yeah, sometimes we do have to do involuntary commitment, but there's a standard that if you have a mental health diagnosis, you don't know what you're doing. So we need to protect you. We have to learn to sincerely validate the rights of humans to make decisions we don't recommend. I used to do it with good intent, but condescendingly. It's up to you. I've learned to try to do it. It is up to you. We have influence, but we don't have control. And if the criteria for having your rights taken away is making poor decisions, we're all in trouble. Next slide, please. So this assumption that people with mental health don't know what they're doing, actually the false assumption that there's higher levels of non-adherence in mental health than medicine. How many of us do everything our doctors tell us to do? One more, this is our last chat request. Put in the chat an estimate of what % of humans at some point in their lives meet DSM criteria for a mental health diagnosis. Who wants to put in a guess a %? Roughly 20%, 100%, 17%. All right. I appreciate y'all jumping in. 90. Next slide, please. 20 to 40, or maybe as high as 50% of us at some point in our life will meet DSM criteria for a diagnosis. Okay. So it's not us and them. It's our job to help the veterans. They're not taking care of us, but it's all of us. It's not us and them. It's all of us. Next slide, please. And let me see, what number slide are we on here? No, it doesn't matter. All right. So how are other ways that we stigmatize? There's something else called diagnostic overshadowing. This is important. Deegan talks about it too. If I have a mental health diagnosis and I go to my ER reporting medical symptoms, they're more likely to be ignored because they'll chalk it up to it's his mental illness. It's in his head. And yet in reality, if you have a severe mental illness, you die 10 to 15 years sooner, and you're more likely to have comorbid medical problems due to poverty, lifestyle, high rates of cigarette smoking, partly because my antipsychotic medication, which helps me be in touch with reality, also puts me in a fog, and medication side effects. Next slide, please. So there's Deegan, normal behaviors seen as symptoms, diagnostic overshadowing, the role of language. Now, I'm not talking about us being the semantic Gestapo. I vent about patients. I don't always say things the right way. But if you say to someone, you are a schizophrenic, you are bipolar, we say you are an asthmatic, it doesn't have implications to identity and stigma. How do you change who you are? Deegan says you are not an illness, you're a person. You're a person with a problem. The role of language, I'm jumping ahead, it's Granello and Gorby. They did a study, and with a one-word difference, in one set of referrals, the referral was a schizophrenic, unnamed, a diagnosis with all these demographics, this age, these symptoms, come up with a preliminary treatment plan and a preliminary prognosis. In the second situation, you are being referred John Smith, a person with schizophrenia, exact same demographics. In the first situation, the label who was referred had more intrusive treatment plans and poorer prognoses just based on that one word. And if I was making a referral to you, if I said, I've got a referral to each of you, I'm referring you an access to, frequent flyer, non-compliant, resistant, antisocial, bipolar borderline, is that language creating a plethora of creative ideas, or do you want to choke me? The language creates barriers in our mind. Next slide, please. All right. So yes, we have stigma too. Certainly that word borderline, we react to that. We have our own negative biases. We sometimes, because we're not seeing getting better, get compassion fatigue and hopelessness and get overly pessimistic about recovery. Next slide, please. We're just human. This isn't to pathologize the professional. And this is a big problem for all people. Next week, I'm doing a training with Dr. Greg Townsend from UVA Med School on racism and social justice. We overgeneralize based on skewed samples. That's what the clinician's illusion is. I don't see people getting better, and I think this is representative of everyone. And so my perception becomes people don't get better, okay? I have a handful of veterans who are real. They yell at me, they're mean to me, so I get frustrated. All veterans are this way. Veterans run into a couple of jerky providers. All providers are that way. The culture of non-disclosure, there's more research that shows that if you're a mental health provider and you need mental health care, in facilities where you can't get it or won't get it due to fear of stigma, the patients have more stigma. It trickles down. Next slide, please. So how do we reduce stigma? Well, education has limited, it helps a little, but not so great. Advocacy, Corrigan talks about using righteous anger. He doesn't mean anything dangerous. He means confronting it when you see it. But what tends to help the most is contact, stigma busters. Like in the VA, we have over 1,000 peer support specialists. And peer support is spreading and has spread throughout the country. All veterans, all have their own mental health problems, all in recovery. And don't use the book language, but talk reality to other veterans. And veterans love peer specialists. Next slide, please. And stigma affects identity, and we can have an illness identity. And too much insight at the wrong time can make stigma and recovery worse. So if a veteran insists they don't have schizophrenia, but they admit hearing things and seeing things, and they're willing to take meds and have therapy, I'm not going to have that debate. I'm not going to push that down their throat. I'm not going to say I agree with them, but it's pointless. Great. Let's meet you where you're at and work on where you want help with. Next slide, please. So when we talk about freedom and autonomy, how important is it to you? I mean, next slide, please. And this is what people want from their mental health providers. People with mental health problems. This is a classic study, Ralph Lambrick and Steele. Treat me as an equal in planning my services. Give me freedom to make my own mistakes. Watch for the prognosis of them. Validate people's rights to make decisions that you clearly don't recommend. And trans-diagnostic issues like hope, meaning, purpose. These things matter to all humans. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to tell a story, and then that should leave us about 5 minutes for questions or comments. Back in 2007, when I was our first MICM coordinator, before I became the local recovery coordinator, there was another veteran we worked with. And we got to know him very well because we worked closely with him. We got to know the person underneath the label. He was diagnosed with some details changed, schizoaffective disorder, which was a diagnosis, by the way. Should we keep it in DSM-5? Should we not? Should we not? Yeah, we'll keep it. He probably had borderline IQ, lots of secondary medical problems, brittle diabetes. Man, he loved the Chinese buffet, but he was a wonderful man. He had a great sense of humor. He loved music, had good taste in rock and roll, could play some piano. And he lived in very good supported housing. And probably back then we would use the term low functioning, which is another stigmatizing phrase. He said, you know what? I want to go out and live on my own. So the MICM team, with me leading it, was like, there's no way he can live on his own. He's too sick. He doesn't have enough skills. So we superficially validated his right to decide. Well, it's up to you. But we strongly educated him on the probabilities of why it was a bad idea, and we talked him out of it. We said, phew. And that shoe was mostly for him. We were worried about him, but providers have narcissism too. I've worked very hard to get you stable, and then you go out and crash and burn. Who's going to have to pick up the pieces? We are. So it comes up again. Months go by. I want to live on my own. And this time he means it. He really means it. And again, we offer education on the probable negative outcomes with good intent. We superficially, condescendingly validate his right to decide. He's gone out on his own. Okay, to our credit, we went with it. Find him a good place to live. And he goes, I know you guys don't think I'm going to make it. I'm going to prove you wrong. And we wait for it. It's not going to work. We wait. The veteran starts crushing it. He starts doing great. I get shivers telling the story. He's functioning. He's asking for sharps for his sugar. He'd never eaten a canned vegetable in his life. He's eating canned vegetables. He's crushing it. Like a jaw drop, like mic drop, right? Now he doubles down. I want to get in touch with my parents. This veteran was in his 50s, hadn't seen his parents in probably 20 years. When he lived with his parents, he had done some incredibly inappropriate things. His parents had all kinds of problems. Trying to protect the veteran, we were stigmatizing his family. They're so toxic. Why do you want to pull the rug out now? You're doing so great. Oh my goodness. Okay. This had no chance. His parents he goes and moves in with his parents. His parents forgives him for everything he did. He forgives them everything they did. They show each other love they hadn't had in 30 years. He gets back in church. He has a stroke and he dies. The sad part about the story is not that he died. The last 2 times I saw him, and he had never done this. The first time he gave me a hug. The second time he told me he loved me. I am 99.9% sure if I said to this veteran, you can stay 10 more years stable where you live now, never with a chance to live on your own, never with a chance to get back with your parents, or the 3 best months of your life in 30 years, he'd have taken it. Folks, he had every right to go crash and burn. If I could do 2 things over, I would do them over. To our credit, we helped him, but if we would have told him no, we were this close to telling him no. He would have complied. We had no right to tell him no. What I would do differently now, I've learned to sincerely validate the rights of people to make decisions they don't recommend. And I still would have offered education on the probabilities, but I forgot about the possibilities. Here's why we're worried. We think we're concerned about it, but we'll come up with a backup plan. You have a right to do it. If you want to go for it, we'll help you any way we can. All right. I'll take any questions or comments. some resources. Allie, did you see anything along the way that I missed that you'd want me to address?
No, I think you've gotten everything out of the chat. Wonderful presentation, Chuck. Just super inspiring. And I live and breathe this stuff, and I learn new things and was re-energized. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to do it. And there's my contact information if people need anything.
Thank you very much.